welcome back to the Lemon Abroad. Today I wanted to talk to you guys about the next step in my Moving to Italy series, and that would be looking for an apartment. At first I thought this video would just be about the process of looking for an apartment, but the more I started writing down things to talk about, it also had me reflecting on my own experiences that I've had in finding apartments here and all kinds of things that I wish I would have known sooner or that I wish I would have known to look out for. So like any new experience, I feel like there is a big learning curve in looking for an apartment in a new country for the first time. The norms and expectations that you would have at home are going to be different. The technical and legal procedures are going to be different. And if you aren't aware of these things up front, it can really put you at a disadvantage and also can make it easier for you to be taken advantage of. So that's why I've put together this little video also explaining how to look for an apartment and also explaining some red flags to be on the lookout for. Okay, so first let's begin with actually how to look for an apartment in Italy. The first thing that I would highly advise you to do is to actually wait until you're in Italy when you rent an apartment. Of course, you can begin to look online before you arrive, and that will be really helpful also to get an idea of what's out there. What are the different prices? What can you get for your money? What are the apartments in the different neighborhoods looking like? But of course, online pictures can be really deceiving. So I think it's best just to be here in person, go visit the apartment yourself, meet with the landlord, meet with the property manager, so you can actually know what it is that you're renting. I would absolutely wait to get here before signing any documents, so that way you can get a feel for the property and the people that you'll be dealing with. So as I mentioned, the first place to start looking for apartments would be online. There are many different websites that are used throughout Italy that list houses both for sale and for rent. Two of them that I would look on frequently are called idealista.it and immobiliare.it. You can also go on Facebook, and especially in larger cities, there will be many groups that say Case Affitto a Roma, a Palermo, a Napoli, and you can find houses and rooms that are available to rent. You could also join the local expats group on Facebook, and they will also have some guidance probably about where you could start looking for apartments locally. Of course, once you're here, you can just start walking around the neighborhoods you like. Keep an eye out for signs that say affitto. This means rent in Italian, and there will probably be a phone number, maybe a little description of the apartment that is available to rent in the building that the sign is posted on. I would definitely start looking online so that you can get an idea of the average prices for certain sizes of apartments in different neighborhoods. For better or worse, as everyone has told me every time I've gone to look for an apartment, you really do have to go see it in person. And you will probably need to see a lot of them. Like I said, photos online don't usually paint the whole picture, and this can really go in both ways. So you might find a house online that looks really cute, but when you go there in person, the photos made it look much larger than it is. And in fact, it's a very small apartment. And on the other hand, there may be photos online of an apartment that looks really dim, but once you go see it in person and you open the windows, it's actually a beautifully lit apartment that you would have had no idea otherwise. You really do have to get out there and look and go to places that you think will be good, and also some places that you think, I'm not sure about this, because they may surprise you. So the first criteria that you'll be looking for when renting an apartment is what kind of apartment are you looking for? To be completely honest, if you are able to, I would consider renting a room in an apartment first, so sharing the apartment with flatmates. One, I think this could be a great way to begin meeting people in a new city, but it also takes some of the pressure off of you. I have found a lot of learning curves in renting apartments here, and honestly, I still am learning even after having lived in 3 or 4 apartments here. It can be really helpful to have other people who have been there before and who know a little bit more about what they're talking about. As well, it can just be fun to share an apartment with people, and it also takes some of the burden off of you and the responsibilities off of you having to handle everything by yourself. So if you're looking for a shared apartment, you'll be looking for a stanza. and that would just mean the room inside the apartment. If instead you are looking for an apartment yourself, you may be looking for what is known as a monolocale or a bilocale. So a monolocale is a studio apartment. So usually there is a kitchen and then a bedroom area and maybe a little seating area all inside one room, and then there would be a separate bathroom. A bilocale instead would be a 2-room apartment. So in this way, you would have the kitchen and the living area, you would have a separate bathroom, and then you would also have an additional room, which would be the bedroom. And of course, it only goes up from there if you want to have 3 rooms, 4 rooms, etc. You're also going to want to take a look to see if the apartment is arredato or furnished. If the apartment is non-arredato, then there is really nothing inside the apartment. It means there is no kitchen, it means there is no furniture, it means there is no washing machine, it means there's even no kitchen sink, really. There is nothing in this apartment, and it is up to you to bring everything. So this has never been an option for me. I've never been interested in completely furnishing a new apartment because I didn't know if I would be staying in that apartment for a long time, and it would be a big investment to buy all of that furniture. So instead, I've always looked for apartments that were arredato. So of course, arredato can mean different things to different people. So if there are things that are important to you, like a washing machine or an oven, make sure that those are there and that you see them. Maybe, for example, you don't need an oven, but if you enjoy baking, then of course that would be something you would want to make sure is there. I would never rent an apartment though that did not have a washing machine. I think that would just be too much of a hassle, and I have seen apartments that are listed as furnished without a washing machine. But if you find yourself in a situation like that, you can always tell the landlord that you would really like to move in, but you would need a washing machine, and you can see if they would agree to purchase one for the apartment. You might also see some apartments listed as semi-arredato, meaning that maybe some things are staying with the apartment, maybe the kitchen, but the previous tenant is taking their furniture with them or something like that. So it's always good to, when you're having a walkthrough with the landlord, ask them what furniture is part of the apartment and what will be staying and what will be going. Also, of course, you may not be able to check the appliances until you've moved in and had the electricity turned on if it isn't already, but make sure that as soon as you move in, you check all the appliances, make sure anything that came with the apartment is working, because if not, you will need to have the landlord have someone come in and either repair them or replace them, because if they are part of the apartment, then that would be the responsibility of the landlord, generally speaking. I'll talk more about that in my next video on renting an apartment here. Something else I would take into consideration is whether or not there is an outdoor space for you to use. This is something that for me is really important. So especially if you're renting an apartment by yourself, it could be that the apartment is small, or it could be that sometimes you just want to go outside without actually having to, get dressed and go downstairs and go get a coffee, sit outside with the people. Sometimes you just want to be able to go on your own balcony, sit, have a coffee, and look outside while you're in your pajamas. So for me, in every apartment, I've always needed to have at least a small balcony where I could go out and get some fresh air. Also consider that you're going to need to dry your laundry somewhere. So for example, if you only have one small balcony, you'll need to put the laundry drying apparatus on that balcony. So maybe you want to have 2 balconies or something like that. There may already also be lines that are strung up outside of one of your windows or off the edge of the balcony, so you could also put your laundry there. Just something to keep in mind. One thing that you might not think about initially, but I would have you keep in mind, is whether there is an elevator. In Italian, it's called an ascensore. It can sometimes be tricky to find, but if it's something that you are going to realistically, pragmatically think you need, I think it's worth holding out for. And this is why. You might think that, oh, I'm fit, I can walk up these stairs and it won't be a problem. And that can be true, but consider when you are going on vacation and you have a few really heavy suitcases that you have to carry up and down those stairs, potentially by yourself, or you're coming home and you just did a big shop at the grocery store. In those moments, and I've been there, I have really wanted an elevator. So I would just be realistic with yourself. And if that's something that you think you're going to need, look for an apartment that has them. They might be a little more tricky to find, especially in neighborhoods with older buildings, but it's not impossible. One thing to consider as well is whether or not it's important to you to have a building that has a doorman or a portiere. The only reason that I can think of why this would be a significant consideration is if you're someone who, for example, gets frequent packages in the mail and you really need someone to be there to sign for them and make sure that they get delivered. I can only speak from my own experience, but every time that I've had boxes be mailed to me, it's not something where they will just leave them in the lobby of the building, as maybe is more common in the United States, for example. Usually there needs to be someone there to receive the package. So if this is going to be a serious consideration for you, it's something to keep in mind. There do exist in some cities smaller private post offices where I think you might be able to get mail delivered, but I'm not sure about that. So now I wanted to talk about some of the extra costs of renting an apartment in addition to the monthly rent. For example, if your building does have a portiere or someone who sits at the door, you will probably have a condominio fee attached to your rent. You might also have condominio fees even if there isn't a portiere, and these just cover random expenses of the building, like the lights in the hallway. I would say it's pretty much 50-50 whether or not an apartment will have them. When you're renting the apartment itself, you will obviously be asked to make a deposit. This is usually 1 month's rent. I would give you a word of warning to be very attentive to the conditions of your rental contract in terms of getting your deposit back. Now, typically, the way you recoup your deposit is by not paying the last month of your rent. So when you decide to leave, you would just not pay the last month and keep that money, and that's how you get your security deposit back. But in your contract, and I'll explain why a little later in the video, there should be a clause, there needs to be a clause, for how you can end your contract early. And I've seen this be 6 months formal notice, 3 months formal notice, 1 month formal notice. Usually they want a registered letter or a registered email, depending on the contract, sent to them in this given time period in advance. Now, many people I've spoken to have said that this is just a formality. However, depending on the relationship you have with your landlord, it could either be a formality or it could be a hard and fast rule. Many people have told me that no matter what, you should get your deposit back before handing the keys back of your apartment. But depending on the relationship you have with your landlord, if you didn't give them the notice in the time frame that they requested, this could become a little contentious. For me, I would say the best advice would be to ask your landlord to make a smaller time frame that's more realistic. So for example, 1 month's notice, because especially with the rental market here, I feel like 6 months, 3 months, that's a lot of time in which a lot of things can change and you might not feel secure. I would ask before signing the contract if they do have a lengthy time period, like 6 months notice, to see if they would be more comfortable to adjust that to maybe 1 month notice or 2 month notice, something that's more realistic. That way you can feel comfortable signing the contract knowing that, yes, I would give 2 months notice. That's something realistic that I could do. And that way you could just avoid any problems later on. The next bill that you should think about will be the electric bill. So here you would refer to that either as luce, meaning the lights, or the bolletta. It's very common to say. This is usually just a light bill, but it could be that you also have gas service in your apartment. I have never had that, so I don't know how much that would be or how much that would come into play. I've always had a gas tank in my apartment that you replace on your own every few months, and I think it's a very economical option. But this is, of course, decided by the building and by the appliances that are already in your apartment. So if you are speaking about just a light electricity bill, they usually come every 2 months. If you have your own apartment, then you should have your own light meter, and this is called a contatore. You will find when you're looking for apartments that some landlords, especially if they own the whole building and it only has a few apartments, they will just try to have one electric account for the entire building. Apart from this technically not being allowed, it can also lead to a lot of problems. Usually one tenant is then responsible for being in charge of the light bill, which can be annoying, especially if some tenants are disagreeing or unwilling to pay. So this is a red flag that I would definitely look out for, and I would say it's a serious consideration to not take that apartment. When you are looking at apartments, this is definitely one of the questions that I would ask. And you can also ask for the previous bills of the current tenants so that you could get an idea of how much electricity the house is consuming and how much you can expect to pay. In terms of the water bill, I've seen landlords try to manage this a few different ways. One would be to just kind of write off the water bill as part of your rent. And once I had a landlord who had individual meters for each apartment and would divide the water bill, and we would pay based on how much water we had used. I can say that doing that, I realized that you really weren't consuming that much water. So I wouldn't let someone try and convince you that they're doing you some big favor. The reason that a lot of landlords operate this way for the light bills and for the water bills is because it can be a real headache to go and change the names and do these switches. It's called a vultura for who is in charge of the bills, especially when people are only staying in apartments for a few months or a year or two. But for example, if you were buying an apartment or you're staying in an apartment for a long time, you would probably at some point or another change all of the bills over to your own name. So it's definitely nice to, I guess, not have the trouble of going to the office and changing your name, but just don't let someone convince you that they're doing you a huge favor. It's pretty standard for things to operate that way. Okay, so now about actually going to rent the house. What about when you first call a landlord or a realtor to tell them that you're interested in a property that you've seen online? Be prepared that one of the first things they're going to ask you is, where are you from and how do you make money? Basically, are you employed? Are you a student? What are you doing here? What are you doing in general? While it is absolutely not allowed, I have found in my own experience and also with many people I know that landlords will sometimes say, oh, I'm sorry, and that's if they're saying it politely, I don't rent to people who aren't Italian. And this can be very disheartening to hear. I don't know the reason why. I think sometimes it has to do with bad experiences in the past or prejudice or thinking that, yes, the procedures are different here than they would be in someone's home country. So maybe it's too much of a headache to try and explain this to people who don't really know the system. Of course, you can't really ever get to know the system if you don't get a chance. But even after living here for 3 years, I've still had experiences where I've called apartments on the phone, told them that, no, I've lived here for 3 years, and they will still tell me, sorry. In terms of these types of situations, I've always said that while it is disheartening to hear, I would rather know that ahead of time instead of going into a arrangement with someone who feels that way. And I think that that's also another red flag. And even though you might be disappointed, I would say just move on and don't get hung up about it, because there's probably a better apartment and a better situation waiting for you. As I mentioned, they will also ask you if you can show a proof of income. For people who live in Italy, so do you have a work contract? Even better, do you have an unlimited work contract? Because here the work contracts are either for a short period or for a long-term period. If you are a student, you might have a little bit of an easier time because, of course, if you're renting a room, it's a lower cost. So as I mentioned before, one of the things that you're looking for in your rental contract is that there is a clause to exit early. And this is because most rental contracts here in Italy are for many years. You can find contracts, for example, just for 1 year, but it's not very common. So usually there are, let's say, 3 different types of contracts. There's 4+4 or 4+4. There's 3+2 or 3+2. And then there's a 1-year contract, which is actually a 1+1. So what this means is that the contract is written for 4 years or 3 years or 1 year. But if at the end of that period, neither the renter nor the landlord has decided to terminate the contract, it will automatically renew for another 4 years, another 3 years, or another year. The reason why is another bureaucracy reason, is that it costs time and money to register the contracts. So the less frequently a landlord has to do that, the more that they can save. I think sometimes they think it's better to just make them for a long time, because then if you stay for 1 year or if you stay for 3 years, they didn't have to do any extra work. But this is why it's very important that you do have that exit clause, and that it is a realistic exit clause that you will be able to abide by, even if it is more of a formality. So whether you have a contract for a few years or for 6 months, for example, if you're renting a room as a student, your contract should be registered with the tax agency, the Agenzia Entrate. This is very important if you are planning to stay in Italy. So the first reason is that if you are coming to Italy on a student visa or a work visa, you will need this receipt as part of your documents for your permesso di soggiorno. And also, if you are moving to Italy on a more permanent basis, you will need this receipt in order to apply for your residency. I'm going to explain more about this in another video, but suffice to say that it is essential if you are moving here to apply for the residenza, because it's how you will access national and city services. Unfortunately, there are landlords who are unwilling to do this. You'll see that in their advertisements, they will explicitly say no residenza, only for people who are fuori sede, which means that they're coming to the city only for a short period. Maybe they're going to study for a few months, or they work there a few days a week, but it's not going to become their primary residence. And simply put, this is done to evade taxes and just to have some cash coming in every month. If you see this type of contract and you are not looking for that, then it is best to, again, just move on. Don't be too disappointed. I know it can be difficult to not be disheartened when you see a really nice apartment and then it says no residenza, but in the end, if you are staying in Italy, that is something you need, so it is not negotiable. One more thing on this topic is that you will need to see that there is a receipt of registration. And this is something that should not take a long time at all. It's one of, I think, the fastest bureaucratic processes I've seen here. Maybe a week, maybe 2. When I first moved to Italy, I did not know I needed a receipt. I took it for granted that they told me the apartment had been registered. So later on, when I went to access a city service, I was unable to because I didn't have this receipt. And it led to a very contentious situation, but in the end, thankfully, it was resolved. However, it was a lot of stress and it was not worth it. If you find out that this happened to you, then you need to start looking for a new apartment. And it is possible that if you make your case that maybe you'll have to go to the police, maybe you'll have to file a denuncia because they told you that they registered it and they didn't. That could maybe change their mind, but either way, I would start looking for a way to get out of there and find an apartment with a landlord who is willing to abide by the rules, because it is something that not only does it create a difficult situation for renters generally, but you will need to have this in order to access a lot of things here. So in general, it's just not fair to ask you to go without this. So this kind of leads me to talking about the landlord situation in general. And this is something that I would say, I mean, you can probably find this everywhere in the world. I wouldn't say this is a uniquely Italian problem or a problem unique to Palermo at all, but maybe some of the things specifically, there are certain patterns here that now, having lived in a few apartments, I'm becoming more aware of. Making this video is actually, I think, given me some kind of purpose for maybe why I had to go through those experiences, because now I can sit here and share them with you. So hopefully you can see the red flags that I did not, and you can move on and find other apartments where things are nice and comfortable. And I really hope you do. The first thing I would say is do a vibe check of the people you meet. If something seems fishy, it is. Make sure that you also know who it is you're going to be dealing with and meet everyone involved. So there could be a realtor, there could be a property manager, there could be the landlord, there could be the landlord's second cousin's nephew who is managing things for them. There could be any number of people who you're dealing with, but make sure you meet them and get a feel for them. Definitely the landlord and definitely who is ever your point person. If there is someone other than the landlord who is showing you the apartment, who is explaining these things to you, make sure you meet the landlord as well, because that person can just as easily disappear as soon as you sign the contract and you're left with dealing with the landlord. One thing that could be a red flag is when you are signing your contract, if the realtor or the landlord or whoever else asks you to pay for the registration of your contract, because under most contracts, they should not be asking you for any money for that. And furthermore, like it happened to me, they should not be asking you for money for that and then not even register it. So best to just be aware of that. If there is a realtor involved, they will also be expecting a fee of 1 month's rent. So that's just something else to keep in mind, that you may have to put more money up front in order to secure the apartment. So as you can probably tell by the story I just told you, and I really hate to say it, but I have had some bad luck with landlords here. I know I'm not alone. I know many people who have been in situations where they've been taken advantage of, and it's not just people like me who've come from other countries. This has also happened to people I know who are Italian or who've lived in Italy for many years. These things, they just happen, but if we can be more aware of what's going on and what red flags to look out for, then it's obviously going to be better for us, so we don't end up in a bad situation. Generally speaking, of course, newcomers are more likely to be taken advantage of because landlords will know that we don't know all the rules, we don't know the norms and the system. Tenants actually have a lot of rights here in Italy, and you can find them online. If you look up clauses in your contract, you will be able to find evidence that what is your responsibility and what is the landlord's responsibility. But you definitely have to be assertive and say with confidence that you know what you're talking about. I have had many things happen to me where landlords asked me for money that I didn't need to pay them, and you have to be really strong because you can feel kind of like a fish out of water, and maybe they know what they're talking about and I don't. But if something doesn't seem right to you, you can look up online whether or not this is part of the legal code. And if you need to, you can get legal assistance. Sometimes it happens that if you have a friend who is Italian who will call your landlord and be like, listen, we both know that that's not how it works, that's usually enough to get them to back off. All this is to say is do your research, and if something doesn't seem right, look it up, talk to a friend. However, if you've had one of those situations, it's probably going to happen again, and I would suggest looking for another apartment. Okay, so one more thing to look at when you are searching for apartments in person or online is to know that in Europe, at least compared to the United States, I don't really know elsewhere, the floors are numbered differently. So what that I would call in the United States is the first floor, here is the ground floor, or piano terra. So then in what I would refer to as the second floor is really the first floor, and so on. You might also see piano rialzato, which means that it is the ground floor, but it's not level with the ground. It's a little higher up off the ground. Or if you see ultimo piano, that means it's the last floor of the apartment building. You will see that the ground floor apartments do tend to be less expensive, but this can come with some trade-offs. I don't think that means you have to write off the ground floor completely, but take a look at the security situation, take a look at the quality of the building, especially if it's a piano rialzato. That could also avoid some problems of, for example, if you live somewhere where it rains a lot or something like that. I do have to say that that every apartment I have lived in has sooner or later gotten mold. It usually shows up during the winter, at least here in Sicily, and I think this is because the buildings, especially older buildings, were built with a mild climate in mind. So in general, regulating the temperature and regulating the humidity is not the easiest thing. You also definitely need to consider the temperature regulation situation in the apartment, and you need to consider this before you move in, even though that's difficult because if you're moving in during the fall or spring, you don't really know how the apartment will adjust to extreme temperatures. And I've had experience where I've really not needed to use a heater, maybe just a fan in the summer and some heavy blankets. I've also lived in apartments that have extreme temperature deficiencies. So in the summer, it would be boiling hot, even hotter than it is outside. And in the winter, it would conversely become incredibly cold, again, even colder than it was outside. So you should see if the apartment is equipped with, for example, windows that could create a cross breeze in the summer and help keep the apartment cool. Or is there a condizionatore? This is a little box that is very popular here and it operates as a heating and cooling unit. I would say that's probably the bare minimum because you don't know how the apartment is going to react to the extreme seasons. It would be my advice to always make sure there is at least a condizionatore. That way you know that you will be able to have some heat or some cool when you need it. Back to the mold, that is something that, like I said, you won't necessarily know about it until maybe winter comes. If you do have this problem, you need to tell your landlord right away, and you're going to be able to gauge a lot about them by the reaction that they have, because they will either send someone over to treat the mold and then paint it, or they will kind of write you off. Again, this is a problem that is not going to go away, so I would definitely recommend at least considering looking for a new apartment. There are health considerations to keep in mind, and there are professionals who know what they're doing and have the proper gear to protect themselves. Furthermore, it is 100% the responsibility of your landlord. So if they try and tell you, oh, just get some bleach, then that means that they don't really care. Even though, as I've said, it seems pretty common, it is something that is not to be waited around on. It could potentially be dangerous for your health. And so I would definitely ask your landlord to treat it and also begin looking for a new apartment. To close this video, there are a lot of things to look out for when you are looking for an apartment. There are a lot of things that I think are essential. For example, having a heating and cooling unit, having a contract that will be registered with the Agenzia Entrate, having a washing machine. There are also many people who are looking for apartments, probably more than there are quality apartments available. I know what it's like to be very discouraged and very tired of looking for apartments. I know the feeling of being very tired of being rejected because I have an American accent or for one reason or another. And I really know the feeling of feeling like you're never going to find a place to live. But I would strongly advise you to not take an apartment just because you feel like you can't find a better one. I would strongly advise you against taking an apartment where it seems like things are maybe done a little off the books, where you have doubts about the quality of the building material to withstand the cold, where you really don't see yourself being comfortable. Because when you are desperate and you are willing to take something, even though you have serious doubts about it, sooner or later, I think that's going to come back to haunt you. Because when those doubts you had do come to pass, and your apartment is incredibly uncomfortable due to the winter, or your landlord is asking you for money for things that really aren't your responsibility, you're going to be even more desperate to find another place to live. So if it is possible, I think it's much more worth it to stay for one more month in a B&B while you keep looking for an apartment, rather than settling for an apartment that is just going to cause you more trouble down the road. Of course, we can't know all of these things before we move in. We can't know someone's true colors. We can't know how the building changes in the seasons. We can't know X, Y, and Z, but we can look out for these red flags and listen to our gut instinct. I hope that this video has just been able to give you some advice and give you some red flags to look out for. I'm sure there are more, but these are just the ones I've experienced myself. And these were things that I could have never expected. These things happen, and I'm sure they can happen anywhere and to anybody, but what they have taught me is that you really do need to be as selective as you can and cross your fingers. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Ciao!